For me, it's a great privilege to have somebody who I learned by, a teacher. Not stam a teacher, but a teacher who was able to pin me down to learn every week, and I had to arrange all my travels around his schedule. So I think he's the only person who was able to do it. He's a Sofer that not only knows how to write, but knows the halachas through and through and teaches them and trains Safrus. Some of the Koile Jungelite throughout the years have learned by him Safrus. So I also learned by him Safrus. I never actually took up the job, but I learned it. Since now in Gittin, where we're up to is the halachas which are connected to writing a get, and specifically halachas which are negeya to chak teiches, chak yireches, mukav kvil, these halachas. So it's always good to have somebody who actually knows what he's talking about. There's Rabbi Fitz, Rabin.
This is a tour. I need your yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Shochat, for your generous intro. And for the privilege of delivering over here in the Chosheva Koilo. So, Rosh Koilo asked me to give a shtickle overview in the inyanim of Chak Teiches and Hekef Gvil. So I'll do my best. The pasuk in Parshas Kiseitze, which speaks about the mitzvah of giving a get, the Torah says, because of law, Sefer Krisos, that he has to write for her a Sefer Krisos, a get. So, the Brisa in Gittin Daf Chaf Amud Aleph is brought. The Brisa says, "V'kosav v'loy v'chokak," that a get has to be written and it's not allowed to be engraved. So, just as one hakdama, mitzad adin, a get doesn't need to be only written on paper. A get could be written on all kinds of stuff, or even engraved, or into a sheet of wax, or verschiedene different materials. So the Gemara asks, what do you mean a get is not allowed to be engraved? We have a clear brisa that a get is allowed to be engraved, a Mishnah. So the Gemara answers, there's two different kinds of engraving. There's chak teiches and there's chak yireches. Chak teiches means that you, in the process of engraving, you carve out the space at the center of an ois, and you carve out the perimeter of the ois from the outside. B'meila, the ois is boilet b'derech l'meila. You didn't do anything active to create the ois. You didn't do something directly in the ois to create it. You did something indirectly by virtue of the way in which you borrowed out the hollow on the inside and the perimeter on the outside, and now the ois appears. That's called chok teiches. Teiches is moshen toich, the inside, and also the outer perimeter. Shenken chok yireches means that you borrowed out of the piece of wood or the wax, whatever it is, the actual Avery ha'ois. Yireches like the yerech, right? Like the thigh, meaning the oisius are thought of as having different parts, like a roish, a regel, etc. So you, if you did chak yireches, you engraved the actual thigh, the actual body parts of the letter itself, and that's what you dug out of the material, then that's indeed considered ksiva. That's okay. The Hagdara is that you have to directly create the ois, and not that the ois emerges as an indirect outcome of something else that you did. Then the Gemara asks the question, what about a stamp? So the way they used to make coins back in the day, they had a mold, and the mold had hollowed out within it the form that was meant to be impressed onto the coin. then they would press it against the coin. So the Gemara asks, what's the gather over here? Do we consider that the parts that are projecting in the stamp are pushing away the sides, right? The toiches and the inside and the perimeter, and then the metal of the coin is like, by virtue of that, is b'derech mamela being boiled, because the toich and the chutzala is being pressed away? Or do we say that somehow this process forces the metal into the mold in a way that the image on the coin is emerging b'derech chakireches in a way that the form itself is being created? And the Gemara answers that in that kind of case, it's taka chok teiches, and it's possible. So the Gemara asks a question from the tzitz, because the tzitz, regarding the tzitz, it says michtav pituchei choisel, and we know that the oises of the tzitz were popping out. The kodesh Hashem on the tzitz were protruding. So the Gemara asks, if they were protruding, how was that done? But they had some kind of a mold, and in the mold, the oises kodesh Hashem were recessed, and they pressed the mold onto this thin sheet of gold, and through pressing the toiches and the chutz of the oises, the rest got sucked into the cavity of the mold, and it should be considered chok toiches. So the Gemara answers, no, they actually pushed out the oises from the back. So that's also chok yireches, even though they're going from the back side. But since you're doing a chiyuv dike ma'aseh, you're doing a chiyuv dike thing to have the oises protrude, that also qualifies as ksiva. There's also an interesting toisus on the spot. The toisus asks, l'chayr, the Gemara could have asked from the luchos. The luchos was called michtav elikim, and it was engraved. So the toisus says, the Gemara is asking a stira from Gittin on Gittin instead of running to some other sugya. So this is what's established over here in the Gemara, is that the gather of ksiva has nothing to do with ink and paper and writing the way we typically associate with it. Any way you form letters is called ksiva, even if there's nothing there, even if it's engraved through and through. That's also considered ksiva. The catch is, v'loy v'chokak, that the word ksiva negates engraving, it's negating any kind of engraving that basically creates the oishes in an indirect fashion. She didn't do a ma'aseh b'gufois. So in this Gemara itself, what gets covered is Gittin, because it says v'kos Allah Sefer Krisus. What gets covered is the tzitz, about which it says michtav pituchei choisel. And from Tosfos we see clearly also that the luchos also, about which it says ksiva, also fundamentally has that same quality of ksiva, because the oisis themselves were engraved, were borrowed out of the stone. Nowhere in Shas, parenthetically, is this ever discussed in relation to stam, to Sefer Torah, Tefillin, and Mezuzahs. But there's a Tosfos in Sanhedrin, Ksav Libuno, that from which it's clear that Tosfos takes for granted that this din, this psul of chok teiches, applies also in the Sefer Torah, Tefillin, and Mezuzahs. Although it's interesting that the Rambam omits this legamri. There is no reference to the psul of chok teiches in Hilchos, Sefer Torah, and Mezuzah. Even amongst the 20 things that are, the list of 20 things that are posel in a Sefer Torah, the Rambam legamri omits it. It only brings it in Hilchos Gittin, which is interesting. But all of the majority of the Rishonim and the Poskim accept that the psul of chok teiches applies also to stam, which is intuitive, because regarding stam we have a pasuk that says uchsavtam. So what emerges is anywhere where the Torah uses the expression uchsavtam explicitly, chok teiches would be prohibited. Now, obviously, the most obvious question that shows up is, but what do you mean? There's no such thing as engraving stam. In stam, we have a halacha l'Moshe Sinai that it has to be written with dioy on cloth. There is no possibility of engraving stam. So how does this question of chok teiches, of engraving in any way, either chok yireches or chok teiches, appear in stam altogether? So we'll leave that question on hold for 1 second. And we'll just go to the Gemara in Shabbos. There's a very interesting Gemara in Shabbos. Daf Kuf Daled Amud Beis, where there's a Mishnah that says, Higia ois achas chayiv. If a person was magia one ois on Shabbos, means he corrects one ois on Shabbos, he's chayiv. The Gemara asks, what do you mean higia ois achas chayiv? When it comes to the malacha of ksiva, we know that you're only chayiv minat Torah if you wrote 2 oisius. Why? Because that's, where do we find ksiva in the Mishkan? And they wrote the oisius on the kroshim in order that the kroshim should be realigned. Each one should be put back in the place that it was before, and they should be realigned appropriately, so they would mark the kroshim, the aleph, beis, etc., etc. So in order for that labeling to be functional, they had to write at least 2 letters, one on this keresh and one on this keresh. Like this, they matched up. So because the lamates malachas all replicate the functions of building the Mishkan, so the Gemara asks, how could it be higia ois achas chayiv? Even if I'm kosev only 1 achas, I'm not chayiv in derais. So the Gemara answers a couple of scenarios. One scenario is Kagoin shenot loy legagay deches v'asoy shnei zainin. You have a ches, which, the way the ches is printed in the siddur, there's just one flat roof. So in that case, it means that you took out a piece in the middle. You erased a piece of the ink in the middle of the roof. Or if we learn, like Rabin Tam, that the ches had a chatiteres. In other words, it was covered one leg and then it went up like this, like the hump of a camel, and then it continued. So if you remove that part, the point is that you basically remove the part in the middle. You scrape it away. So then you have 2 zainin. So over here you were magia 1 ois, but effectively you created 2 oisius. That's one answer the Gemara gives. So you made 2 oisius. So that hago is considered chayav on Shabbos Masad Ksiva. Another answer of the Gemara is that you erased the back of a dalid and you turned it into a resh. Okay, so what's the problem with that? So Rashi explains that with this you were mashlim the Sofer. In other words, like it's like a b'china of makeh b'patish or something like that. There's a unique status to going ahead and manipulating one letter and adjusting it, turning it into what we need. If with that one letter, the whole Sofer becomes kosher, for example. The Rishonim discuss, is this necessarily talking about a Sefer Torah, or could it be talking about one of the Sifrei Nach? There's a lot of discussion on this. But the core question that the Rishonim raise is that if you're not legage the ches, if you remove the middle part of the gag of the ches, and through this it becomes 2 zainin, it's possible mitzad chok teiches. So Yuvaita didn't accomplish anything. You didn't do a ma'aseh ksiva. Once we established that a ma'aseh ksiva is defined by directly creating a noise, and over here, how did I create my 2 zainins? Through an indirect function, through removing the middle, but I now have 2 zainins off to the side. So that's not called ksiva. This is the question that we're trying to ask on this Gemara. So the Rashba in his Chidushim says, no, this is not called chok teiches. This is not called chok teiches. Why? Yeah, it's because it's like you're separating 2 oisius. 2 oisius that touch one another, which now we just overlapped into the halachos of Hekev Gvil. 2 oisius that touch one another. There's a Gemara in Menachos, Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav, Kol ois shevein Gvil mukaf la medal d'cheseha psula. Any ois that is not surrounded with gvil, with parchment, that is, all around, is puzzle. And the Orim G'dolim explains that what's Rav really saying? What's the context to Rav's statement? The context is that there's a brisa that says that you can't have 2 words too close together, or else they'll be read as one word. And you also can't have a gap too big in middle of a word, because then that one word will be read as 2. So the Rabin explains, so Rav is coming along to say, so you would think that in order to bavarn a word, not ending up being read as two words, I'm going to mamish make the oisius mamish so close together, I'll even touch them together. Comes again, Rabin says, no, that you can't do. There needs to be gevil, there needs to be parchment all around the circumference of an ois, and it cannot be touching another ois. However, the Rashba over here is clearly implying that if you're just going to separate two oises that are touching, that doesn't constitute chok teiches. B'meila, the Rashba says that I removed the center of the roof of the ches, and now I have two zainin off to the sides. Okay, so it's like two zainin were there all along, just touching each other, and now I separated them. That doesn't qualify as chok teiches. That's the chiddush of the Rashba and the chiddushim. And then about a second case of the Gemara, the Daled, the Gemara says that you're chayav on Shabbos if you have a Daled and you scrape the corner off to make it round, to turn it into a race. You're also chayav on Shabbos. So the Rashba says, okay, so that would be like a tipas dioy, like maybe like a drop of ink fell out of your kolmos, and you removed it. So the Rashba is introducing a fundamental chiddush over here, that there are scenarios in which you could manipulate an ois, and it's not going to qualify as chok teiches. We're not going to say that this ois was not written. You wrote this ches. You wrote this ches. And now you're removing the middle of the gag. We view it as if two zainin had been written here that got touched and b'meila it looked like a ches. But we're not going to say fundamentally that these two zayins were not created in a direct way. They were created in the b'derech b'meila way. You wrote them. But it's as if they touched and we're separating it. Or we're not going to say that this reish was created in an indirect way. You wrote an ois over here. And there's a akev, there's a thing that sticks out to the right end of this reish and makes it a dot. Yeah, it's like an extra drop of ink landed out of your kumul. It's like a haphazard thing, and you can just remove it. This is the chiddush of the Rashba.
So what is, you're not writing anything then? If you're just moving something that fell, so you're not really writing anything.
Oh, that's a good question. So the Ran comes along, together with most Rishonim, the Mordechai, and many others, and says that's not the pshat. The pshat is that l'gabe Meleches Shabbos, we don't require the same status of ksiva that we require in a get. Meleches Machshavos also Torah. You're doing a creative act over here. You're creating two oisis when you remove the middle of the ches and make two zainin. You're doing a creative act by making this daled into a reish. For Shabbos purposes, you've written. But these cases will still be considered chok teiches. If they were to occur in a Sefer Torah, in a get, they would still be considered chok teiches. What emerges from the Ran and from Rov Rishonim is that this whole exclusion, this whole psul of chok teiches really applies only where the Torah says the word uchsavtam. When it comes to the Lam Tes Malachas, the Torah doesn't say the word uchsavtam. The Torah says not to do malacha on Shabbos, and we learn from Melechas HaMishkan. So l'chayra, since we don't have the word uchsavtam over here, that would be also why it's not necessarily we go based on the intention, based on the Melechas Machshavos. It's a creative act. You're shafting two oises. What comes out from all of this? But parenthetically, the Rashba himself is soiser himself. He has a tshuva where he's soiser his pshat in the Gemara, which he writes in the Chidushim, and all the Achronim struggle to try to reconcile. Some say that in this he just meant Minat Torah, it's not chok teiches, but Midir Rabbanan it is chok teiches. There's a big discussion how to reconcile the Rashba's stira between his Chidushim and his Shuvas. But I'll call upon him. What emerges over here is all of a sudden we're in a conversation where there's clearly a scenario of chok teiches, not only when you're engraving something into a board of wood or a plate of wax, But clearly there's a scenario of Chokteches when we're dealing with Dioy ala Sefer, with ink on paper. The cases that are showing up over here in the Gemara is where you have one ois, and through scraping some of the ink away, that manipulates, that transforms it into a different ois. So these are already very advanced cases. If we were to back up, the most straightforward, simple scenario of Chokteches would be a drop of ink lands on the paper, it dries, and then you scrape out the Toich ha'ois, the Chutz la'ois, and a letter emerges. That would be classical Chokteches, even though you're not engraving anything into the paper, but you're digging away the ink to have a letter emerge b'derech mamela. Based on this, there's also the same thing would be if a tipas dioy falls on the cloth in the form of an ois. A tipas dioy falls on the cloth and it looks like a yud, let's say, or it looks like a vav. Over here, you don't do any hakika. You didn't do any engraving. Not you engraved the toich, not you engraved the yerch. That also constitutes chok toiches. Why? Because you didn't do a maisa ksiva b'guf ois. You didn't actively create the ois. It happened on its own. So here we see chok toiches not only when you're scraping something away out of the ink, but even when the ink just lands on the cloth in the form of a letter, because you did not intentionally and directly put it there and create that form, it happened on its own. That too qualifies chok toiches, because the core question of chok toiches is: did you do a ma'aseh b'gufa ois, or did the ois emerge on its own, so to speak, or indirectly from your ma'aseh? So these are over here we begin to see the emergence of the scenarios of chok toiches, even when you're writing b'dyoy ala klaf, or when you're writing a get with ink, etc., etc. There's a very interesting smak. Does the smak relied on it all in the Hilchos Gittin, that to remove it after the ois was written? Maybe Malkam Igun, who knows? Yeah, Malkam Igun has a lot of special exceptions. What?
When you're 2 minutes to shkia,
the smak has an opinion that once you write a letter, if afterwards something occurred, like a tipas dioy falls onto the letter, you could remove the tipa. You could erase the tipa, and the letter reemerges, right, on its own, and it's not considered chok toiches. This is the shita of the smak. Also, the Kol Boy agrees with the smak. Many Rishonim argue and say that no, once the tipa falls on the ois and the ois loses its you can't recognize it anymore, then it's nisbatel, and by removing the tipa, either sponging it up if it's still wet or scraping it away, and the letter just re-emerges or resurfaces, but derech mamela through your act of removing tipa, that also constitutes chok toiches. There's just because we're in Parshas Mishpatim, so this is a little bit to connect it in with the time that we're in. It's always fun to do that. There's an interesting Tzemach Tzedek in Even Oezer, Simin Kuf Samach Hei, where he's discussing this shita of the smak, who holds that if the tipas dioy falls on the ois after it was already written, then it could just be removed. And he's also discussing the shita of the Sefer Truma and the other Rishonim who argue and say that no, the ois is considered in his battle in Gansan once a tipa falls on it. And he brings in his Shakla V'Tarya, he brings an interesting idea from what we have this week's parsha. In this week's parsha we have ki yichre v'chiyiftach ish bar, oy ki yichre ish bar v'lo yichasenu, v'nofal shalmo sher chamar. Talking about someone who there's a bar b'shus Rabin, right? Yiftach ish bar means he uncovers it. Or yichre ish bar means he digs it. And some damage comes out of it in the Rishus Rabin, right? So this is a din in the Zikin. We just had it in the Chitas yesterday, I think. So what's the connection? What's the connection to Chok Teiches? So he starts off saying, I want to bring a raya against the smak. Because the Gemara in Baba Kama says, if someone digs a pit 9 tefachim deep, and then someone else comes along and digs a 10th tefach, the last person alone is chayav for nezikin. The first person has no culpability over here, only the last person. The last person is the one who is considered to have dug the whole pit. Shesilek ma'aser. Once he dug that 10th tefach and turned it into a halachic deiraisa dika pit, ma'aser rishon is in the stalik in ganzen. He is the one who's seen as having made all 10 tefachim. Fishe ha'achrin had tikoy mimidas nezikin lemidas misa. Umetoich kach chayev bekol. Nistalik ma'aser rishon lagamri. 9 tefachim deep, yeah, it's taka dangerous, but it wouldn't be chayev for something, it's not considered lethal kind of bur. Once you make it 10 tefachim deep, now it's already moved from the level of nizakin to the level of misa, so nistalik ma'aser rishon. Says Tzemach Tzedek, im kein, kamoi kein ois beis, keshenofal boi dioi v'nasis al-idei zeh pei, harinet kol ois acheres, v'havalei siluk ma'aser rishon. Says the Tzemach Tzedek, based on this halacha nezikin, if a tipas there falls into a base and it turns into a pay through that, now it's nistalik ma'aser rishon. Yeah. According to? Okay, so we're going to follow the Ran, and we're going to say Lagabe. Oh, so the Rishonim discuss, and the Tzemach Tzedek also has a lot of discussion. Maybe it's not speaking about a Sefer Torah. It could be only speaking about a Sefer and Nach, in which case there's no question of Chok Teiches. Because that would only be a psul in the Sefer Torah. Yeah, there's those who ask that, if we're talking about a Sefer Torah, and it is Chok Teiches, even though you're chayav for Shabbos, why are you chayav for Shabbos? Certainly you didn't do anything. Certainly if you did the last ois for sure, you didn't kasha the sefer because chok teiches. No, nach could be written with chok teiches. Right. So again, this is the discussion. Where does the? I think that Tzemach Tzedek has. Yeah, in the beginning of Kuf Samach Hey, the Tzemach Tzedek discusses this. Vale gam bechumish shaykh tikun derova the pirshash from the asal adam lashe sefer shein muge from atishkin balacha avla. So you were masakin it according to Rashi. You were masakin the sefer because now you're not violating atishkin balacha avla. Yeah, because it's accurate. Bazoi, even if it's chok teiches, you still accomplished that. So this is the first svara of Tzemach Tzedek. But then he goes the other way. He says, "Achim kol zeh, gam beki agavna keshachozar v'sosam tefach shahoisif zeu b'ayid rova b'gemara boy rova." If you went ahead and you refilled the tefach and you now made it from 10 to 9, if you made it 10, but then you put in another tefach of dirt and now you made it back to 9. Now whose 9 is it? Is it your own 9? Or is it the first guy's 9? And and the Gemara is not sure about that. Yesh Sofer Gloimar D'Mayda Ovid Shakli V'Nisha Ma'aser Rishon. So the Tzemach Tzedek is saying, so this would be the place for the smak, that when the tipa falls onto the base and turns it into a pei, nistalik ma'aser rishon. But when you remove the tipa and now you revert it back to a pei, it's you come back to ma'aser rishon because the Gemara is not resolved that when you put back a tefach of dirt, it does not, that the 9 that are now here does not go back to the first person. Maybe it does go back to the first person. So this is just an interesting lomdisha conversation where you see a connection between the pasuk in Parshas Mishpatim and Chok Teiches. Who would have imagined? But Torah divrei Torah anim b'makom echad and Hashem b'makom acher. There's so many things that cross over like that. So now let's see let's take a quick look in the Shulchan Aruch and see what is there still to cover. So the halacha dalid is clear based on everything we discussed, right? The Olam learned it already?
Yeah.
Kol Sharbar, interesting. Oh, then there's the discussion of miktas ois b'chokteches, right? That's another big machlokes rishonim, right? If the first half of the ois was aydei chakika or a tipas der that fell, and then you complete the ois through an action, through writing, so that's a machlokes rishonim, and the Beis Yosef over here in Eben Ezer and the Ramah both hold that it's okay, that it's kosher. In other words, as if to say, the ksiva, the moment of ksiva is defined when a full ois shows up. When you're writing a letter, let's say you're writing an aleph, and you write the diagonal shaft. Is there an ois here? No. So how do you view that action? Do you view that action as like a hechsher for the ksiva? It's just a means to an end. It's a necessary thing that you need to do. You need to build all the parts until you have a full ois showing up. Or do you say that, no, that's the ksiva? It seems, based on the Beis Yosef, the Mechaber, and the Ramah over here, that miktas ois b'chokteches is kosher because the moment of ksiva is determined in that moment that your stroke creates the form of a letter. That's when it's considered ksiva. Maybe until then it's considered roshim, or it's considered a hechsher. So, interestingly, in Stam, there's a halacha that if a person wrote a daled instead of a reish, to erase the back right corner and turn it into a reish, that everyone agrees is chokteches. You're making the reish through removing something. So what do you have to do if you want to turn a daled into a reish? What's that? Okay, you could thicken the reish. You could add ink to the back until it's a very big thick back and it's mavliya into it, the protruding top right corner. But let's say you can't do that. There's an ois right behind it, and you can't do that. So you have to erase something, right? So what do you need to erase? How much do you need to erase? And then to be able to rewrite. What would you guys say? In Gittin, you're not supposed to do any erasing because of Chash Ziyuf, right? But in Stam, we can erase. So the Mechaber writes that you have to erase the whole thing. Why? If I just erased the roof, or I just erased the foot, I was mashchis the tzura. It's no longer a daled. It's nothing. So the Mechaber says, because bein hagag or bein hayorich nasa bepisel. Which is a big discussion of the Achronim how to understand it. But let's just say when you wrote the gag, and a daled usually has some kind of protruding sharp spitz that goes out the back right side. So that's puzzle relative to a reish. Now you write the regel, it's ersh puzzle relative to a reish, because now your mom is completing the daled. So both ksivas, relative to what we need, are considered like a puzzle dik ksiva. So therefore you should erase everything and rewrite it. So Rabbi Kiveger asks on the spot, why is this any worse than miktas ha'ez b'chokteches, which in Even Ezer, the Mechaber says is clearly fine. If a tipas dioy falls onto the cloth, and that makes half the letter. The Mechaber over here paskins, and the Ramah brings it, and the Beis Yosef agrees. You could just add al yidei ksiva to complete the ois. So why is this any worse? I did it al yidei ksiva. So it shouldn't be any worse than if a half a letter landed on the cloth. So that's an interesting chumrah that there are chumras in the dinim of chokteches in Stam that don't appear in Gittin, even though the source of the halacha of chokteches in the Torah is in Gittin.
So if you expand the yarech in the account, halacha.
If you fatten the yorich to be mavliya into it, whatever spitz is sticking out on the top right, It's okay. As long as it's done kisidron. Meaning you haven't written anything afterwards. That's another halacha that is exclusive to tefillin and mezuzahs. Okay, so let's touch on hekef gvil for a minute. So we already discussed briefly that the Rashba in the Chidushim said that when you're erasing the middle of the ches and you turn it into two zayin, it's not a problem. It doesn't violate the psul of chok teiches because it's like you're separating two oisius. Like we said, the Rashba, the Sofer himself, it is not the accepted mahalach in the Rishonim. The most of the Rishonim say no. Chayav on Shabbos because we don't require ksiva from Gittin to be chayav on Shabbos. But what we see from here is that the Rashba is effectively implying that if two letters are touching, you can scrape them apart. And this is the mainstream psak that's brought in the Mechaber in Orach Chaim, that when two letters touch, we don't consider it chok teiches to scrape them apart. Why not? Any ideas? So the Alter Rebbe in Siman Lamed Beis Sif Chav Ches explains because a psul of hekef gvil is considered a psul on the outside of the letter, not within the letter. The requirement is that every ois has to be surrounded with gvil. It's a din about the perimeter of the ois. It's not a din about the ois itself. In other words, when two letters touch and they're not mukev gvil, the chsaron, the psul, is not in the ois itself. It's on the outside of the ois. B'meila, chok teiches, the psul of chok teiches does not reach there. Not all the achronim completely agree. The Gra and the Sha'ar Ephraim say that if two letters touch and it happened before both letters were completed, there's a place to be machmer and erase the entire second ois because it's considered nichta b'psul. But most of the achronim agree with the Mechaber that two letters that touch, you're allowed to scrape them apart, and it doesn't violate chok teiches. Similarly, also no problem with consider. The only exception would be if through the two letters touching, they transform into a different ois. Like two zayin that touch and turn into a ches. Even though the Rashba and the Chidushim says, it's not chok teiches because it's if you're separating two oises. But lahalacha, if two oises touch, like a chaf and a vav touch at the top, and it turns it into a mem. So then it would be considered chok teiches to scrape them apart. But in an ordinary case where two letters are touching, then it's a psul of hekef gvil. It's possible the way it is, but you're allowed to scrape them apart, and it doesn't violate chok teiches because the psul of hekef gvil is fundamentally outside of the ois. Where's the source for the psul of hekef gvil? Rav says kol ois shein gvil mukav lo medal d'chaseh psula. Yeah, the letters can't be so close within a word that they touch one another. Yeah, but why not? And Rav says his din by tefillin and by a mezuzah. As a matter of fact, he doesn't even say it by Sefer Torah. Some of the Rishonim wonder, does it apply to a Sefer Torah? And the answer is yes, of course it applies to Sefer Torah, because the whole brisa that's talking about not making the oisius too close together, not making the words too close and not making the letters too far. It's talking about a Sefer Torah, and Rav says, Kol ois she'en gvil mukif lamadal d'chaseh psula. Gvil is a reference to the kind of parchment that only a Sefer Torah is, primarily a Sefer Torah is written on. So the consensus is that yes, it applies to a Sefer Torah also, but does it apply to Gittin? So l'choira, if there's a tesis that says that the real psul of two letters touching is a psul in ksiva tama. In other words, by mezuzah it says uchsav tam mezuzah beisecha. Uchsav tam, Chazal darshan has to be ksiva tama. The ksiva has to be wholesome. And so this is the flaw in the tamus haksiva, in the perfection of the ksiva, if two letters are right. Chsavtam doesn't apply to Gittin. But then you have the Tosis about the Me'ura, right? About if the Oisis are touching one another in a get, then that is Chok Teichas. And although, according to one Pshat and Tosis, the Me'ura doesn't mean that they're touching, it means that the Oisis from the top line go very, very far down into the bottom line, which isn't that the way a get is written, Bepoil, right?
For the Ashkenazim, yeah.
For the Ashkenazim, yeah. So, Lamaisa, we have over here that what? No'agu lahachmir sheyu ha'oisis mukafos gvil. It's not a requirement maker adin, hekef gvil and Gittin. The consensus is that it's really a function of uchsavtam. Oh, the Chagam brings afakab sefer al fin hekef gvil mechsavtam ksiva tamo filu hochin machmirin lechatchila. Right. which is other than the concern of separating it to the chash of there's no chash of ziyuf over there. Oh, v'chein noegin not to scrape them apart because of chash ziyuf. Okay, so there you go.
If it's a hairline,
They'll separate it. They'll separate it. Just one clarification. What do you mean make it bigger? They'll make one ois included in the other.
one ice to swallow. If they catch it while they're doing it.
So it just for whoever's tracking over here in Stam, there is a Bach where the Bach writes that if kol oyer ha'ois dvuka lachaverto, if two oises are touching like top to bottom, then the Bach holds that would be considered that the tzuras oises are gone, and you wouldn't be allowed to scrape it apart. And Achronim say that even if the negia is thick as a one whole oivi kulmus, which is the thickness of the kulmus that you're writing, if two letters are touching so much, that also would invalidate them, that you wouldn't be allowed to scrape them apart. But generally speaking, when we talk about that you're allowed to scrape apart two oises that are touching, it means they're just touching a very little bit. So in Stam, it's actually puzzle as long as they're touching. You have to scrape them apart in order to make it kosher. In Gittin, Meikar Adin, they could even be touching that. I see that they're like they're Amal Paskins, that we don't even scrape them apart necessarily. What?
Who's going to say that they're touching a lot of power? They're touching a lot.
The Bach. Kol oyer ha'ois dvuka b'chaverto is his lashon. It's a discussion in Achronim. What exactly does he mean? The consensus is that even if it's touching only one oivi kulmus, right, which means as thick as your kulmus is, let's say a gimel. Let's say the word Gan Eden, I don't know, whatever, and the whole foot of the gimel, the forward foot of the gimel, touches into the langanun, the whole thing, then that would be considered like the tzuras oisis are gone, and now it's no longer a psul only of hekef gvil, but to scrape them apart would also violate chok teichos. I want to just complete with one inyan, just a little bit of a more inward inyan, that we know that yes shishim ribru oises latoira, right? Yisrael is Rosh Hashanah, yes shishim ribru oises latoira. So I think that there's a profound message over here that the psul of chok teichos, that every ois in the Torah has to be created, has to be formed directly. It can't be that indirectly it shows up as a result of some activity done outside of it. And I think this is also a message for each of us in our lives. Every one of us is like an ois in the Sefer Torah, and sometimes people they're not necessarily, sometimes it can be hard to bring yourself forth and bring out your full potential and do your avodas Hashem in a way that's proactive, in a way that's you're doing a ma'aseh b'gufa ois. You're bringing yourself forth. You're actualizing your potential. If you're around other people and the other people are shining, then but somehow you show up, somehow you fit in, somehow you live your life like this on the sidelines of others. And I think this is in Afshis Torah Sanefesh. This is a message over here that chok teichos is possible. In the Kruvim, it's a different story. But when it comes to an ois in the Sefer Torah, which every Yid represents ois in the Sefer Torah, that's our job, is to not just be living our life as an adjunct, as an adage to other people, but to be fully what you could be and who you are. Sure.
Thank you very, very, very much.
Thank you.